Okay, perfect. So, what? Okay, my other microphone wasn't working. Okay, so let me restart that. Organizations, companies, and individuals, we're almost all on social media. And we're using it for a specific reason. We're thinking we can get some tangible or intangible benefits from social media. What I argue is that one of the linchpin from participation in social media is something called social capital, or in an online version, what I call social media capital, that you cannot get anything, no return on investment from engaging in social media, unless you have developed this online social resources. So what we're going to cover today is just to gain an understanding of this form of this new type of company asset, how to appreciate it, how to build it, and then in the form of an analytics translator, measure it. So we're not going to cover code this time, but that will come in a few months. So let's jump to why we care about social and relationship capital. Here, if you saw my webinar back in March, I did talk about the International Institute of Reporting Consortium, the IRRC, and their 6 capitals, their integrated reporting framework. So they have 6 capitals, or 6 resources, or 6 assets. Financial capital and manufacturer capital. This is something all accountants are raised on. That's what we deal with. The other ones, human capital, intellectual capital, social and relationship capital, are fuzzier. They're not as well defined. They're harder to measure. They're harder to quantify, but they can be equally important for any organization's success. So we're going to focus in on one of them, the social and relationship capital, and specifically in its online form. And the push behind this is that intangible assets are becoming so much more important for the market value and just the overall earnings and growth of a company. I used this example before of Elon Musk and reputational capital, as reputational capital was huge and very important for Tesla and the other companies he runs, including now Twitter and SpaceX. So this was an early example when his marijuana on the Joe Rogan podcast, and what we saw happen to the stock price of Tesla immediately after that incident. And his reputational capital has just plummeted after he took over Twitter. And I honestly do not think he's going to recover in terms of Tesla. It might recover a little bit, but his reputational capital among the people who are most likely to buy a Tesla, more liberal people, is just shot. So reputational capital is huge, and social capital is another type of intangible asset. So social and relationship capital, I'll just call it social capital here. This is a parable from David Hume, a Scottish philosopher back in the 1700s. And what it gets at is how these hypothetical farmers, they could help each other out in this village, but they don't. And so the point of this is not that these farmers are evil or dumb or lazy. The point is that they're trapped. They're in what we would call a prisoner's dilemma. The prisoner's dilemma is just a fancy social science term for that there's a collective action problem, which maybe is social sciencey as well, that people cannot get together to do things that would be in their common self-interest. So it would be in the common good for the farmers to work together, but they don't. And the reason they don't is they don't have social capital. And so social capital is one way to think of it. We're going to approach it from a number of angles, is the resources that you get from participation in social life. So they are resources embedded in your social sphere. Another way to think of it is they are network-based assets, or they are social assets that are in a form of a network. Here's another example. My first academic job was in Western New York over 20 years ago. And if any of you are are new to Canada or have never lived in a cold place, you might, for me, I grew up in British Columbia. You see this and I've never seen it before in my life, and you think, wow, that's beautiful. What the heck is that? And then you look, that is amazing. I should maybe take some pictures. And then you see this. You see what happened. There's basically no power. And so we were out of power for, I think, 7 to 10 days, that first ice storm in Western New York. And what was amazing to me is not just being out of power for 7 days, but that one side of the street had power and one side of the street didn't. And this was a neighborhood that had a lot of social capital. A lot of people knew each other and trusted each other. So you saw electrical lines, power cords just running across the street, all the way up and down the street, cars driving over it. That's fine. But you could think of so many neighborhoods where this would not happen. And so the point of this, in your real life, you have a network, and there are resources in that network, whether it's job leads or help or just companionship or people helping each other out, not like the farmers in Hume's parable. So you have a network, and there are resources. Way to find out if you have relatively low social capital. And for a lot of you have likely moved from somewhere else in the world or somewhere else in the country. And one of the toughest things about moving to a new country is you basically have to build another social network. And so you've lost whatever social capital you had in your former country. I did a mini move. I moved to California, and starting up that social network again, and starting the social network again when you move to Western New York, and then when you move to Toronto. So social capital is a critical thing. And if you can understand what you lost when you left and moved to Toronto, then you will understand what social capital is. So similarly, for individuals, social capital is critical for companies and for organizations. And if you want to understand how to get something out of social media, if you or your company are on social media, if you want to understand how to get something out of it, how to get a return on investment, you have to understand online social capital. It is distinct from what is offline, and it is more important. And so I call it social media capital. So on social media, it's a very disruptive technology. And so it's more social capital here, and social networks are more important using this technology. And so networks are seen in more and more types of phenomena, and the networks are more important, and it can facilitate a lot of different types of ties. So first, let me just walk you through how to understand this. So social media capital, online social capital, these online social resources are important for getting a return on investment from individual or your company's social media activities. But you need to understand why you are using social media. So you need to have a plan. So here's just an example. An influencer who wants to post attention-grabbing images and build a social network. But if there's no plan at the end, what is that influencer's social capital worth? You could probably guess, not much. If any of you are South Park fans, you may recall the Underpants Gnomes. And these are gnomes who have this great plan to just steal the South Park kids' underpants from their dressers. And eventually it will lead to profit. When later on in the episode, you find out that their plan has 3 phases, and phase 2 is just a big question mark. And this is how I like to think of a lot of people and a lot of companies' use of social media. So they really have no plan how they're going to get some type of return from that. And so what I'm talking about today will be get you halfway there. So it's an intangible asset. If it is a strategic asset for you, then you're going to want to model it and focus on the value creation. So modeling how this fits in your value creation model. And this is something that traditionally in accounting training, there's not a lot done on this. It's more backward thinking and just how to understand this language of business rather than be good at forward thinking. And so that's something that accounting education has tried to just improve on all the time. And so the integrated reporting framework has this cause and effect relationship where they have this very generic model of how these different intangibles might fit. It's really generic though. It's just really getting you to think about how to use these models and how to think of intangibles as being important. That's really the important part of this model. And so what I have here is a generic model for online social capital. And so it helps you hopefully understand just what the whole value chain might be for this. I created this figure for nonprofit organizations. You might think of very similar things, just different strategic outcomes for a for-profit company, such as sales or brand loyalty. And so social media capital, this online social assets, has a couple of unique characteristics. And so I'm going to walk you through some of those now. So we'll start right in the center with social media capital there. And so the first thing is that it's the central resource that you get from social media efforts. And so this is probably the key step to understand, is that this comes first. You can't jump around it. What this model is trying to show is that if you want to get anything, if you want to get to the organizational outcomes, if you want to boost sales from social media, you need to build social media capital first. You need to build this online social resources. And the reason is that on social media, the formalized social networks, those ties among different users, is paramount. It's the key. Almost nothing happens of any use on social media without being mediated by these formal friend and follower relationships. So you could think of a message, you send out an Instagram post. Who reads it is largely determined by who is connected to the person sending it. So you need to have built social media capital first. You need to have this online social assets. So a way of wrapping this up, this part, is that on social media, the formalized social networks are privileged, so they're paramount. And because of that, social capital or social media capital has a privileged place in the value chain. It comes first. You could think of the comparison offline. A company could just buy a TV ad. It does not need to have any formalized social network in order for the ad to reach people. So the connection between social capital and audience outcomes is really divorced. On social media, though, almost nothing useful happens unless it's really tightly linked to the social resources and the formalized social network. And so social capital, online social capital, is hugely important. It's what you will develop first, and then you'll leverage it to get any other outcomes. Okay, second characteristic is that it's directly observable. And you can see here, there's a lot of just digital footprints of building a social network. So you can find out how many people liked your post. You can find out how many people follow you. You can find out how many people dislike something. You can find out so all of these digital traces are visible and observable for you, and they're observable by your competitors as well, and observable in real time. And so this is a key characteristic of it that makes it a different type of intangible asset. Unlike some of the other ones that are on or off the books, other companies don't really know except what you put in your annual report. Another one, and the last one we'll cover right now, is it's accumulated according to a power law. And so it's not a normal distribution where, say, 68.2% of the people are found right in the bell part of the top of the bell curve. Age distribution of Nobel Prize winners follows a normal distribution as well. Whereas power law is most things on social media. So you have an example here from just the number of followers of 135 mining firms. You can see it follows not a bell curve or normal distribution, it follows a power law. And so this is what makes it so tough to be, say, an influencer. If somebody has their dream job is to be a social media influencer, is that there's, in this figure here, there's a couple on the far right-hand side that have a ton of followers, 140,000 or 160,000 on Twitter, that are really these winners. And so they would be the only ones who could be the equivalent of influencers on for mining firms' Twitter accounts. So power laws, it's important to understand that it's a rich get richer phenomena. And so you have to be very strategic in what you're doing. Same for nonprofit organizations. Okay, so now we have covered some things about what social capital is. And now go back to the far left-hand side of this model. You can think of this as your value chain or a logic model, how you can develop, how you can get something out of social media use. So the first one, very basic. You need to devote time and money to it. That one doesn't need a lot of effort. The second one is audience strategy. And so this one is absolutely critical, and it ties in with social capital, and it ties in with networks. And so you really have to think at the end point and the starting points, the organizational outcomes and the audience strategy. You need to have figured out which audience members you want to target, or spoken differently, you need to have an ideal target in mind or an ideal audience. Who do you really want to reach? Is it other accounting professionals? Is it other accounting professionals in Ontario? Is it marketing people? Is it consumers? Is it book consumers? Whatever that audience is, you need to really have identified that first before you even jump onto social media. And so that is a key thing. Now, another part, the outputs. What are you going to be doing with your life here? So what you're going to be doing is going to be sending messages, and you're going to be building connections. And so there's this social capital, online social media. I've called it their resource acquisition communication. It can only be developed by these two specialized communicative activities. There's connections or connection building activities, and there are messages. This is unlike offline, where you could think of, how can I build social capital? I can go to Starbucks and meet people there. I can go to a church. I can go golfing. A lot of ways you can build social capital. Online, though, on social media, you can really only build it from these two specialized activities. And so that's where you're getting everything. A way to think of it is websites have this architecture where you might have a really static web page, if anyone remembers the 1990s. Social media has a little bit of that static architecture, but all of the action is in the messages and the connecting actions. So there's a couple of messages from the American Diabetes Association. They're sending messages that show that they have expertise in certain parts of diabetes control. And so there is one on Instagram. There is one from Instagram again. There's some from Twitter. There's a lot of ways you could do it. For the ACLU is there as well. And so why are these messages so important? You can think of, well, how do people actually build social connections offline? And the way they do it is through repeated social interactions. There's research, how long does it take to build a friendship in real life? A casual relationship is maybe 30 hours. If you want to build a normal friendship, takes at least 50 hours. If you want to develop a good friendship, it takes 140 hours. So it takes a lot of time, a lot of repeated social interactions. The way you develop social interactions on social media is by these connecting actions or these messages. So companies need to send a lot of these messages. They need to really engage with their followers in order to build that network. So then next part, we have these what's called connecting actions. So a way to think of this, we don't need to spend a lot of time on this, is that it's just useful to understand that there are a lot of ways an organization can connect with other potential users, and ideally people in the target audience. You can have this friending and following behavior up at the account level where you just follow people or friend people. At the organizational level, at that message level, in other words, you can reply to people, you can like their messages, you can share their messages, you can include hyperlinks, you can include hashtags, you can include user mentions to tag other organizations or other individuals. And through these connecting actions and through the messages, you can just build the social capital. And so that is what is different about online social capital. You really have two ways of building it. It is through the messages and it is through the connections. Here's just one simple one, an organization trying to tag Justin Timberlake because he's a valuable social media user. And people ask whether there's CPE credits for this. Yes, you'll get an email right at the end at the hour mark. So what do we got next? We've looked at social media capital, what it means. And now we can look at what you get out of it. So this is relatively simple as well. We have a couple of paths, in other words, for either converting or using this social media that you've accumulated. If anyone's old enough to remember George W. Bush, when he got reelected a long time ago, he said, "I've earned political capital and I intend to spend it." So political capital is a type of intangible asset too. You've earned it. You've accumulated it through your messages and your connecting activities. Now is the time to spend it. And there's two main pathways. You can either use that to build other forms of capital. And so an organization might ask for donations. So it's asking for financial capital. Another organization might try to mobilize or leverage its social network by asking people to rate a product on Amazon or on TripAdvisor. And so it's trying to convert social capital to reputational capital. Any other organizational outcome could be developed through that as well. Another thing is, here's another organization asking for money. Another way is you can just directly expend it to get other organizational outcomes that are not other forms of capital, which capital is just a fancy term, another way of saying an asset or a resource. You could think of the motto here of the firm Constant Contact. If you remember their slogan, which was turning fans into customers. And so that gets at this process perfectly, that you've developed social capital online, and you are going to convert those network members into sales, ideally. And so you've earned it, and now you can spend it. You can get any other outcomes you're interested in as well. It could be knowledge, it could be stakeholder relationship quality, it could be accountability, it could be legitimacy, it could be customer satisfaction. And so here is a nonprofit organization its outcome is advocacy. It wants people to lobby for them and have spread the word. So public education is one of the goals for this nonprofit organization, and they're getting it by leveraging their network. Another one, using it for lobbying. Okay, and lastly, in terms of how you can expend this thing before we get into measurement, is you can just expend the capital you've developed. So if a company has money, they can build toward those outcomes. That one is pretty simple. So we've covered, just at a high level, understanding social media capital and how it fits into your overall value chain. So let's say you buy the argument that in order to get anything out of social media investments, you need to develop social media capital. And so let's say this social and relationship capital is an important resource for you individually or for your organization. So maybe that's a little bit too generic for you. So let's look at just a couple specific examples and then turn to how you might measure this thing. A really simple one might be just a YouTuber wants to have intention grabbing videos, build some social media capital, and then get YouTube ad revenue. That one's pretty basic. A little bit more sophisticated. Here's a fashion blogger, what we call an influencer now, just a random one I saw a long time ago. So we have this woman who has developed a company called Cupcakes and Cashmere. And from me looking at her business and from her website, her model looks something like this. Social media capital in the center. She has to build this network that she can get something out of. Started off doing a lot of expertise posts. So in other words, took the role of I'm an expert, something about fashion, and uses that to build this network. The key thing, interesting thing about here, this expertise post, is almost all of the influencers, obviously, they give away the advice freely, something before people might have to pay for. And the reason they're giving it away freely is because that is the only way to build a network. So you can think of it as you have to feed your network. And so she's feeding it constantly on all the different social media channels. She is building ties with important audience members. And those are the connecting actions. And what she gets out of it, the endpoints, is book sales and online sales. And so this is very standard. There's other types of revenue she gets as well, from ad revenue and from and consulting. But online sales from the online stores she's developed and book sales are a key thing. And so it's a very common thing for an influencer just to have a lot of the book sales, consulting, any of the online sales just do not happen unless you've developed that network. And it has to be the right network too. So if you want to target golfers in Canada and have book sales to them or some type of online sales, you need to make sure the social network you're building is those golfers. You need to get the right people who have the right money to spend on those types of things. Okay, last example is a generic consulting firm. Wants to get consulting revenue and has identified 3 strategic intangible assets that it needs to develop. It needs intellectual capital. It might have proprietary systems or procedures or tools that it uses. It has social media capital that it wants to generate all of its leads online. And it has reputational capital. So the company would know that all 3 of these things help drive consulting revenue. And there's also the other tangible resources. So we're just focusing on the intangible assets here. It wants to develop consulting revenue. And it also realizes social media capital can help boost reputational capital. So I have an arrow going there. And intellectual capital, the quality of those intellectual and proprietary products will help develop reputational capital as well. And in terms of the input side, the company should be investing a lot in human capital. It could be investing a lot in marketing to affect these 3 things. We see workforce investments will help develop intellectual capital and boost reputational capital when there are better workers. And marketing investments will improve both reputational capital and social media capital. So a company might have a model like this. Is what I would recommend, is that you really need to sit down and see what your outcomes are. If it's only consulting revenue, it's a little bit easier. But then what are your key intangible assets? Just leaving aside the tangibles and other assets that would be on your balance sheet, but looking just at the intangible assets. How are you going to model those? And so what I've focused on here is one of them, social media capital. And so we might think of it this way. Let's zoom in just on social media capital and how it might affect online sales. Now, here is another key step. A key skill is just not only modeling, but measuring these things. And in accounting, we're so used to being almost told what the measure is. So what is the measure for profit? It's a relatively simple one. But when we get to these difficult things, how are you going to measure social capital or intellectual capital, reputational capital? The trick and the very important thing for any of these sort of vague concepts, including performance, when you're giving performance ratings to employees or performance reviews, is that it's very difficult. And so you need to have separated in your mind that what the conceptual level is. There's this imaginary thing out there called social capital. We sort of know what it is. We know it when we see it, but we're not going to observe a number of 6 for social media capital for any one organization. And so the way to think of what the difference between the conceptual and the observational level, it's not exactly the same, but it might help you in case you have any trouble just figuring this out, is that the critical success factor might be social media capital. It is a critical success factor for this organization. And then the organization has a number of KPIs, key performance indicators. And so those are the things you'll actually measure. And so in social media, we have really 5 dimensions and 5 things you might measure for social capital. We have network centrality, we have network size, we have network density, we have network tie strength, and we have network resources. So a lot of you be going, I don't know what the heck you're talking about. And that's completely normal. So we have what I call 5 dimensions of social media capital, and all of them are network measures. And so this is on purpose. So social media capital is important because formalized social networks, so ties among different users and companies, are key on social media. And so how you would measure social capital online are all network measures. And this is one thing I want you to get out of this webinar as well, is just to really come to appreciate the network mindset. And so the network mindset is something that is not really taught traditionally in most people could get through an undergraduate degree and accounting training without having really been introduced to networks at all. For people who are more into analytics or did sociology, they might get this. And so it's a different mind view. So I want you to walk out of the webinar, get a cup of coffee, and just think about the role of networks and how they function, how they're different. And so I'm going to walk you through that and then talk about some of the ways you might measure this. So you might have heard 6 degrees of separation. That's one of the bullet points at the end. And that's Kevin Bacon, 6 degrees of Kevin Bacon, if you played around with that. And so what is this network view? Spend a little bit of time on it. Some people got the first insights in that behaviors might diffuse or spread through network thinking, through social ties, back in the middle of the 20th century. So here's an aerial view of air conditioners in Philadelphia row houses. And what you can see, the X's were put on the picture after. The X's mark the houses that had air conditioning, and without an X, they did not. And instead of it being their insight, instead of it being random, that air conditioners spread throughout the community based on contacts, so that if you knew somebody who had air conditioning, you were more likely to get it. If your neighbor had air conditioning, you were more likely to get it. And so networks, who is in your personal social network, can have a huge impact on a lot of your behaviors, whether you smoke, whether you drink, whether you exercise, whether you swear, whether you play tennis, or whether you play pickleball. All of these behaviors can develop in networks. The way to contrast this is think of the formal structure versus the informal network structure in an organization. So we have this hypothetical drilling company here. And on the left, we have the formal hierarchical structure. And on the right, we have a network structure. And so looking at this, you can see certain people, we can even just focus on Mitchell in the center, who is a real central actor, who also there's a circle around Husan and Milovic and Hopper and Waring, who are the production team, who are really disconnected from everyone else. We have Ramirez, who's also disconnected from people, so that there's certain people in an office setting who might be have an important role in the network in terms of how information flows, how knowledge flows, how rumors flow, bad behaviors, good behaviors flow. All of this can happen. And you can't see this until you break apart from the hierarchical view and go towards a network view. So we have just appreciating that network view of the world is a good thing to do. And so there's a whole bunch of tools called social network analysis that do this. And if you are interested in measuring social media, you should just get at least used to some of the basics of what a network depiction of the world looks like. So at the very basic level, we might have a network mapped among 3 people here. It looks like this. We have 3 people. Those are called nodes generally in social network analysis. And we have arrows indicating some direction. So this could be these edges here, which are called these arrows or edges. What connects people could be almost anything. It could be the flow of books that Anne lends books to Bob, but Bob does not lend books to Anne. Carol and Bob don't share books, but Carol and Anne both share books both ways. And it could be knowledge. It could be meeting people up for coffee. It could be following people on Instagram. It could be almost anything. Could be that connects people, could be represented by network data. There can be a lot of different structures as well that how these people or these organizations or these actors are connected. There can also be different densities. So the one on the left is what we call a sparse network. So people aren't all interconnected, whereas the network on the right is a denser network. The people who are in your network are also connected to each other as well. Another important concept is bridging ties. Once you break a network down and just map out how people or organizations are connected, you can find out some really interesting things. So if you look at this map, if you looked at actor G here and actor A, they have what's called a bridging tie. You can think of go back to your high school days. There are these 2 cliques, these 2 subgroups. And maybe think of the jocks and the computer science guys on the left, and the jocks on the right. And so G and A might be they're friends somehow. And so information or ideas or invitations to parties or knowledge can flow from one of these subgroups to another group only because G and A are connected to each other. So these G and A are important. If you probably would not want to break that tie. When that tie gets broken, let's say G and A are married and they get divorced, then if those groups split up, then both groups have lost. Another you think of A is same thing, a bridging tie there, very important. The actor A is critical. So why another important phenomenon is diffusion and contagion. And so social network people use this in a couple of different ways. And you can think of it even a disease, how it spreads through a network is, the first person gets it and 2 people connected to them get it, then it spreads to the next group, the next group, the next group, the next group. The only person who doesn't get it is this person in green who is an isolate. And so Diseases can spread through a network, and this is, we're all pretty familiar with this from COVID-19. The government wanted to isolate us, so we would be the person in green there, or the two people in green, so we would not get COVID. And so other things can spread as well. Ideas can spread through a network. Behaviors can spread through a network. Emotions can spread through a network. And when there's irrational exuberance, people can buy and sell stocks a little bit too quickly because these ideas spread. If you're not connected to a network, like these two people in green, they're not benefiting from the network, and they're not getting hurt from the network. They're really just outside what's going on in the network. So we have a similar thing here, just a quick depiction of social media idea spreading. Okay, so now thinking back to those 5 dimensions, a first one is centrality. And so if you want to find out how much the quality of your social capital you've developed, is you want to look at your position in your network. And if you do have the social media data and run it through any of the social network analysis software, they can spit out a centrality measure. So a hard number of, excuse me, how central you...
Desktop VGA.
Okay, thanks, Alexa. So you have an Alexa in the office. So centrality is important. We go back to the Mitchell example, and we can see, looking at the informal structure, there are certain actors who are more central in this social network. Mitchell, we've mentioned, is important. He's a central actor because he's connected to 10 other people, roughly. McWaters is a central actor too, has a number of different people connected to him. And we could pretend this network is it's based on who people go to for information. Zahir is another central actor, and Schultz is fairly central as well. We have other people who are just connected. Sutherland is an isolate. Ramirez is an isolate. They're not connected to one other people. If you're wondering if this is really an information flow network, who people go to for advice or information or leadership, you do not want to fire Mitchell, Zahir, Schultz, or McWaters. Unfortunately, Ramirez and Sutherland and Klimchuk, you might be out of there. So it's important to be central where it's important. My argument is that on social media, you want to be a central actor in the network that you have identified through a strategic process as being your ideal network. And so you want to figure out whether you have actually been successful in building that network. And so on to dimension 2. Let's say we have this hypothetical network. Everyone who is connected to, I don't know, say all the golfers in Ontario. You could think of this huge network and see if they're connected on social media. But I've grayed out here the people who are not connected to this $sign. So these are people who, for one particular user, everyone who is connected to that one user. This is what's called an ego network. And you could think of it in your own, let's say Toronto has one massive social network. When we're looking at centrality, we have to look at that whole network. When we're looking at just one person who you are connected to, that's called an ego network. And so the rest of the measures are all at this ego network level. So we can looking at who you are connected to, who your company is connected to. And so the second dimension is simply size, number of people who are connected to you on social media. So this is the most intuitive dimension. So it's the easiest one to quantify. And here, again, it's relatively common. It's a power law. So it's easy to get this data. So easy to figure out how large your network is. It's much more difficult to figure out the quality of that network. And centrality, the previous dimension, is one of those things. Another one is density. So we have some networks on the left can be sparse, on the right can be dense. So the more that we can see here on the right-hand side, some of these networks have mutual ties. Think of your own personal network. If none of your friends ever individually go out for coffee together, you don't have a dense network. But if all of your friends go out for coffee with you and then all with each other individually, if every single person goes out for coffee with every other person in the network, then you have a very dense network. And dense networks can be really good for having strong community ties. They do have sort of a dark side too, is that it can be hard for outsiders to break in. And also, when you have such strong ties like this, it can be hard for new information to break in. And so it's important to have some people who don't all go out with each other. And so, but density overall indicates a tighter community. Another one is tie strength. And so this is maybe not just whether you have ever gone out for coffee with your friends, but how often you go out with them. On social media, it is not just somebody follows you, but how often do they interact with your posts, for example. And lastly, embedded resources and influences. So you would think somebody who knows 100 people and you want to find out more information about, you want to become an angel investor or you want to become a venture capitalist, and none of those 100 people have any knowledge of venture capital, you're not going to learn anything from that network. And so what you need to do is contrast that with another network that has 50 people in there who know a lot about venture capital or actually have money. You have resources in that network. You have a more valuable network. So if one of the people who follows you has 100,000 followers, that's more valuable than somebody who only has 1,000 followers. And so you can get at this. And so what I'd like to, we're not getting into actually precisely using the computer code, how you would measure this. But the whole exercise preceding this is to get you to think, to be like this person, these people in green, the analytics translator. So you are if you're an accounting professional, which most of you are, you're probably not going to become a heavy duty programmer or software engineer or a marketing person. And nobody would want you to, but you need to understand the importance of the intangible assets and how you can approach them so that you can tell actually the coders what data you need and whether their data is garbage, garbage in, garbage out. What you don't want to do is you don't want to leave the social capital and the intangible, the generation of the intangible assets. You do not want to leave that to the marketers, and you do not want to leave it to the computer scientists. The marketers, they're good, but they're doing something different. They don't understand the things that you understand. The computer scientists, they can give you numbers, but those numbers might be junk unless they're relying on you to understand how those intangible assets fit in the value chain of the business. So I'm going to end just quickly with a few just practical insights for people who are ready to make the leap. And you can think of it as your side job as an influencer, or if you just want to build your own personal brand, is you really have to find your niche. And so let's use that example of you want to give advice to and sell a book to golfers in Ontario. That is a very specific niche, and you might target that. Let's run with that. You need to identify your key targets. You need to have identified what your audience is exactly, and be as specific as you can. It might be 1,000 specific people that you want to target on Twitter or LinkedIn or on Instagram. And so you need to have that ideal audience in your mind when you do that. Then you need to choose a voice. And there are a bunch of them. You can be your online presence if you want to develop your personal brand as an individual accounting professional. It could be, think of going on LinkedIn. It could be as a critic or a provocateur. It could be as a curator. You're going out there and finding a lot of new information and then spreading that to your network, and they're finding value in that. You could be more like a teacher, telling people how things work. You can give advice. You could be a marketer. You can connect other people, or you can be an advocate. And so choosing that voice and that online presence, that online role, is really going to be an individual decision. And it should be tied in with your network strategy as well. And then you're going to just want to keep feeding that network. You're going to want to, build that network with the messages and connections, and then mobilize the network by getting them to buy whatever you're selling. I want to leave some time for questions. So these slides are going to be shared. So I put up something about what I call personal learning networks. And this is just a quick way to work here. And if you aren't ready to develop a really strong social media presence as an individual yet, I would always recommend following a Twitter list or a LinkedIn group, following a really small number of people so that you can really understand that niche that you're trying to fill in the market. And the term for that is a personal learning network. So you want to learn something about, say, intangible assets or venture capital. And so you find the people who are experts there, and you learn from them, you listen, and then you go off on your own and start feeding that network, and in the process, building this social capital. And okay, I'm going to just end with a couple of things here before we turn to some questions. So we have, let me see if anybody has any right now. And while we're waiting, so what did I want you to get out of this? Let me wrap it up again. So all of you are on social media personally, and that can be for fun, and that's fine. If you are on social media individually to try to build your personal brand, it's important to go through the same steps that a company would go through, that you need to figure out what your target audience is. And then you need to build social capital, or you need to build that network. And you build it by identifying that target audience. You build it by feeding that network with valuable information in the form of messages, and by these connection building activities. And you want to be able to track that by understanding just the dimensions of social capital, which is building a bigger network, but also building a network that has quality. You want to build a big network of followers that is quality. And it's quality network if you have a central position in that network, if your network has strong ties to you, if it's a valuable network, if it's the right network for you, if it's the one you're targeting. If you have a quantitative measure and it's only the size of the network, that's fine. But you need to consider those other dimensions as well, the centrality, the density, the embedded resources. Because if you don't, you will just have a big network that doesn't serve you for anything. And so what I hope you walk out of here with is just an understanding of an appreciation of what these online social and relationship capital are, and why they're important for individuals, and why they're important for any organization or company that uses social media. And so you will also, just to understand it, you need to have an appreciation for network thinking, for understanding that a network view of the world will really help you understand a lot of intangible assets, and for how to get anything out of social media. I have links to a couple of presentations and papers I've done. What I want to okay, let me get a question here. So Annalisa asked the question, whether social capital is a requirement to be successful in the CPA world. Usually I am what you call a gray area thinker, but I think I can be pretty absolute here and say, yes, Now, I mean, there are exceptions where you can get away without having a digital presence, but there's not really a distinction between online and offline persona these days. If you, I mean, some people, they're in a job, they're never going to leave. If that's the case, they can get away without building a digital persona. But it is more and more important. I think it is critical. If you do nothing else, I would recommend, what do you want to learn about, or what do you want to be an expert on? Go to LinkedIn, identify 20 people that you think, these people always are imparting communication that I really value. And whether it's as an advice giver or a provocateur or a critic or a curator of information or an advice giver or an encourager, whatever that is, pick 20 people, follow those people and learn from them. And then when you're ready, start feeding the network. And so it has to be something that fits with your personality, because a lot of people just do not like going on social media every day. I don't like posting on it every day. And so I wanted to point out just a screenshot of what we have coming up throughout the rest of the semester from now until May. And Tamina is going to put into the chat, I believe she might have done it already, links to the upcoming 5 webinars we have throughout the rest of the semester. So in a few weeks, we have one on blockchain from Peter Kipp from North Texas. After that, we have valuation in the digital, in the metaverse. A finance professor, Veliko Fotak, will be presenting. Then Jerome Niirora from SUNY IT is going to, this will be your first introduction to coding. He's going to do a Python-based data visualization webinar. Then we have a really interesting one from from ICIJ, the people who developed the Panama Papers. And then me, I'm ending on May with this will be a practical one. We'll be jumping into Python. So Jerome Niirora and I, in our 2 webinars, we will be doing both using the same thing. It's called Google Colab, and we'll be sending out information for that, so you can follow along with us in doing the Python code. Both of those from Jerome and I will be very in-depth, hands-on webinars for any level of Python. So if you've never used it before, you're interested in seeing how Python can be used for data analytics and accounting analytics, join us for those. But I think we have the 5 remaining webinars are really exciting, and I think they should be very useful. Please register for those if you're interested at all. And in about 1 minute, you should all be getting an automated email that serves as proof for the CPA attendance. And I just want to say thank you for spending your time this Friday, and I hope you found it valuable, and hope to see you online in a few weeks. Yeah, thank you very much.